Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome from wherever you are joining us today. My name is Nancy Walker, and I'm currently serving as a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center's Africa program. The Wilson Center, through its Africa program and in partnership with Brown Capital Management, is honored to host today's event on transforming U.S.-Africa economic engagement into a 21st century partnership. The Wilson Center's Africa program works to address critical issues in Africa and in Africa relations and to build mutually beneficial partnerships and understanding. We want to enhance knowledge, and we want to promote a positive image of Africa in the United States. Our meeting today speaks to all of those goals, and we're delighted that this discussion could not be more timely given the upcoming U.S.-Africa Leader Summit. I would like to start by recognizing some of our guests and agencies here today. Commissioner Wachenga, ambassadors, all protocols observed, Mr. Ambassador Green, distinguished colleagues from the State Department and the Pentagon and the Department of the Treasury, from competing think tanks too, and from across the U.S.-Africa policy world. We're delighted to have you here, and we are delighted to have so many folks tuning in from many different time zones online. Thank you very, very much for being here. The participation and recognition is a recognition of the importance of the events today. We're talking about trade. We're talking about economic development. We're talking about the digital divide. We are talking about important aspects of the future of U.S.-Africa relations, which are highlighted and will be highlighted in the upcoming summit. Let me begin by turning the program over to Ambassador Mark Green, the Wilson Center's president and CEO, has a long and distinguished career of public service, including serving as a member of the House of Representatives, president of the McCain Institute, president of the International Republican Institute, United States ambassador to Tanzania, and is administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development from 2017 to 2020. Mr. Ambassador Green has a passion and a commitment to Africa. His leadership on U.S.-African relations is extensive and enthusiastic. Sir, podium is yours.
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks for this opportunity to add my words of welcome to all of you. It really is good to have you here, whether it be in person or online. It is really hard for me to overstate how important I believe today's discussions are, as well as how grateful I am for the support and partnership of our friends at Brown Capital Management, Mr. Keith Lee, Mr. Eddie Brown, Mrs. Sylvia Brown, and Mr. Mike Forster, although I have to let you in on the secret. He's actually secretly dual-hatted, whether he knows it or not, because he is one of our own here at the Wilson Center and has helped to do so much in terms of setting up the architecture of our center. Ladies and gentlemen, Congress established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago with the mission, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. What that really means is that while many centers deal in data and information, we've been tasked with going further into scholarship and learning. Our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations and ideas that decision makers can turn to and trust. And we are fiercely nonpartisan. And all of that really makes this a perfect place to host today's discussion. Since 2015, thanks to the generous support of Brown Capital Management, the Africa Forum has been a premier platform for substantive and solution-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and development issues in Africa, as well, of course, as U.S.-Africa relations. Last year, we hosted the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area as that free trade area was approaching implementation. In August of this year, we hosted the heads of over a dozen African sovereign wealth funds for an in-depth discussion on the pressing issues facing these funds, but more importantly, in the role that they can play in development in Africa. Today's event takes place against the backdrop of President Biden's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit next week. The summit, as well as the meetings that will take place in its margins, offer a perfect opportunity to re-examine the future of U.S.-Africa relations. It is a moment for all of us to rededicate ourselves to turning our relationship with African leaders into a true partnership, into a real collaboration that helps African leaders, especially young African leaders, claim their future. As Nancy mentioned, I am an unabashed Africa enthusiast, and I really do believe that we are entering Africa's time on the world stage, a time when young African leaders will not only lift Africa, but help to lift the world. And America must be a true friend to Africa, not dictating and directing, but walking side by side, hand in hand, as Africa rises and claims that future. And that means collaborating to get tools and resources into the hands of African entrepreneurs. Private enterprise remains the greatest force on earth for lifting lives and building communities and creating opportunities. Young Africans are raring to show us all that they can do, all that they can mean. And so really our job is to amplify their voices, to help them harness their ideas, all with the help of American investment and engagement. And today's event and the discussions next week will help us all craft plans to do just that. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I know it will be a lively discussion and an important discussion for Africa, important discussion for Americans, and making sure that those collaborations are vibrant and lasting. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you, Ambassador Green. It means a lot. Now let me turn the floor over to Mr. Mike Forster, who is representing Brown Capital Management, our generous sponsors of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. He's currently the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer, and prior to that, as Ambassador Green noted, he served as the Chief Operating Officer and Financial Officer here at the Wilson Center. A pleasure to welcome you back to familiar haunts. Mr. Forster, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nancy, for that generous introduction. Also, thank you, Ambassador Green, for the introduction. On behalf of Brown Capital, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event on transforming U.S.-Africa economic engagement into a 21st century partnership. I would also like to thank our partners, the Wilson Center. That sounds weird saying that. For their support in organizing and hosting this event. As Ambassador Green mentioned, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is a platform for providing substantive policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. We address both the challenges and the opportunities to Africa's economic development while also addressing the potential for mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa economic engagement. Since its establishment in 2015, the Africa Forum has hosted 18 events, published 8 policy papers, all focused on U.S.-Africa economic relations, and convened over 1,600 policymakers, U.S. and African officials, practitioners, subject matter experts, and business leaders. This absolutely is incredible, and for me, a little bit biased in saying the convening power of the platform here at the Wilson Center is unquestionable and, in my opinion, unparalleled. Today's event is both the continuation of and the start of a conversation. I mentioned to our speakers this morning that in 2015, the very first Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event was held, and it discussed the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2014 under the Obama administration, the challenges of increasing U.S. trade and investment with Africa, and what could be done to enhance the economic relationship. One of the things discussed in that event was the misperceptions that often skew U.S. engagement with Africa. The Africa of 2022 has transformed from that of 2014, and the U.S.-Africa relationship has come a long way, but there is still much work to do. As you know, next week, President Biden is hosting the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. I believe that's this week. We are continuing the conversation and focusing on areas of greatest impact and recommendations to building true partnerships with African countries based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. It is also the start of a conversation following this event. The Africa Forum will publish a series of 5 policy papers with recommendations for advancing progress in critical areas of economic interest. It is our hope that today's discussions and the subsequent papers are the start of continuing dialogue that, along with the outcomes from the summit, truly build 21st century partnerships between African countries and the United States. I would like to add my thanks to our speakers, to Commissioner Muchanga, and to you, our guests, for joining us today, both in person and also online. This promises to be an insightful dialogue, and I am looking forward to the panel's analysis and recommendations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. What people here haven't seen is he's been visiting with all of his pals, and I know he is missed here at the Wilson Center, and I know Brown Capital is lucky to have him. We're delighted you were able to represent Brown Capital Management with us this morning. What do we want to achieve? We've heard what our plan is. How do we define success, as one of our speakers posed in a pre-event discussion. We want action. We want real things to happen. We want to be able to offer concrete policy recommendations on critical issues in the economic relationship. I want us all to think about what is success for you in the U.S.-Africa relationship, what is success for you as we watch and listen and carefully observe what transpires next week as President Biden hosts his counterparts at the U.S.-Africa Summit. I'm sure we're looking forward. I know you'll join me in looking forward to our expert panel of speakers. Let me briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Their full bios are in the program and on the event page. First, we have Dr. Whitney Schneidman. He's a senior international advisor for Africa at Covington and Burling, a member of the Wilson Center's Africa Programs Advisory Council. He has nearly 40 years of experience working across Sub-Saharan Africa. Whitney, that makes you and me among the old timers here. It's okay. It's okay. I understand that on the continent, wisdom is respected. So we'll just take that. He's working across Africa. His paper, his discussion was titled Africa's Century and the United States, Structuring an Enduring Commercial Partnership. Our second speaker is Dr. Joy Kategekwa. She is a globally respected international trade and investment, law, policy, and capacity building development expert. She is a regional strategy advisor at the United Nations Development Programs Bureau for Africa in New York and leads the advisory on the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement portfolio. She's the founding head of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Regional Office for Africa in Addis Ababa, where she led UNCTAD teams in supporting the design of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and advised governments on trade, led growth and capacity development strategies. She will talk today about recalibrating U.S. economic engagement with Africa in light of the implementation of this Continental Free Trade Agreement and in the days before the African Growth and Opportunity Act is hopefully reauthorized. Our third speaker is Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa. He is the Director of Agriculture and Rural Development at the African Union Commission, where he leads efforts to develop and promote continental policies, frameworks, and programs that contribute to agricultural transformation and rural development in line with the African Union's Agenda 2063. over the last 20 years, making him relatively young compared to me and Whitney. He has worked with national and international research organizations and has been actively involved in food and agricultural policy, both as a researcher and a practitioner. He will speak about U.S.-Africa engagement to strengthen food security. Our next speaker is Ms. Prensilia Boagay. My apologies. I don't like to do that. She's Google's head for Pan-African Institutions, Government Affairs, Public Policy, where she oversees policy engagement with the African Union Commission, the UN Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, among other regional organizations. For nearly 2 decades, yes, another youth, she has helped to advance humanitarian, economic, health, environmental, and tech policies in Africa. This included service as a diplomat in the United States Foreign Service with assignments in Mali, Morocco, and Ethiopia. She will speak about accelerating Africa's digital transformation for mutual African and U.S. economic prosperity. And our final speaker is Dr. Raymond Gilpin, who's beaming into us from Mauritius, where he is leading a giant conference himself. He is the chief economist and head of the strategy, analysis, and research team at the United Nations Development Program, the Regional Bureau for Africa in New York City. Prior to joining UNDP, he was the academic dean at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, my old haunt, and economics director at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's also worked at the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Central Bank of Sierra Leone, where he served as its research director. His topic today is refocusing development financing for sustained and sustainable growth in Africa. May I please join me in welcoming all of our speakers, and may I invite them to come up to the podium stage, or whatever we call it. And Raymond is here with us live. Terrific. Each of our speakers has been asked to speak on the specific topic for three minutes, and we are hardcore here at the Wilson Center, which will be followed by a moderated panel discussion and then questions and answers with both our in-person and online audience members. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Whitney Schneidman, our first speaker, and he will moderate the conversation after our speakers each give their 3-minute presentations. I know, I'm hardcore, but Whitney and I can do this because we've been around a long time. We will then have, Dr. Schneidman will engage all of our speakers in a conversation, and then we will very happily turn over the microphone to our guests, both in person and online. Without further ado, fellow old person, Whitney.
Hello, old person. Okay.
We can laugh, but one of the treats about being in this business for so long is to be able to reconnect with old friends, and I see some in the audience, and it is a real pleasure. The U.S.-Africa policy world is a small one, and if we weren't this lovely community, we wouldn't be able to achieve as much as we do. So with great pleasure, I hand the microphone to you.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's true, sometimes I feel as old as the Rift Valley, but I try to stay, in fighting shape anyway, because there's a lot to do. So this is just a great conversation, a great panel, and I think we should just jump into it, right? So, as Nancy said, my paper is entitled Africa's Century in the United States, Structuring an Enduring Commercial Partnership. So Africa's century, what does that mean? It's a big idea, right? We're talking about the 21st century. And I think it's important to think big and think long term. And how do we structure our relationship? And my paper is broken into 3 parts. What's going to define Africa's century? First of all, that phrase, I think, President Ramaphosa said it in 2019, this is Africa's century, and we want to utilize it to good effect. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken said it, he's been to Africa 3 times in the last year, and on each trip he said that Africa has shaped our past, it's shaping our present, and will shape our future. So what are the dynamics? No question, first one is demographics. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. By 2050, there'll be 2.5 billion people on the continent. 1 in 4 people on the face of the earth will be in Africa. The median age is 19, and that has tremendous potential, tremendous challenges, but tremendous potential. I think that another dynamic that will define the Africa century is regional economic integration. That is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Africa is on pace to become the world's largest free trade area. And it's expected by 2030 to be a market with a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion, which is the world's 5th largest economy. That has profound implications for commerce, for trade, for investment, for intra-Africa trade, for how the United States needs to relate to the continent, to play its part, to make its contribution, to make sure that the AfCFTA is realized. I think a third dynamic that is at play is obviously climate change. And we saw that at COP27 last month. And it's no secret that the developed economies are the emitters, and the developing economies have been most impacted. So how we address that issue in coming decades is going to be critical to the livelihood of everybody on the face of the earth, but particularly in Africa. And let's face it, it really boils down to a couple of fundamental issues, but I think the key issue is financing, because we have to mobilize the financing to ensure that adaptation takes place, to ensure that technologies are developed, to ensure that technologies are deployed. A fourth issue, we'll hear more about it, but I just wanted to flag it, and that is digital innovation. This is such an exciting area for me, and I know Priscilla and others. Here's why it's so exciting for me. As I mentioned, the median age on this continent is 19 years old. And we know what happens when you put young people together with technology and then you give them a cell phone, right? And there's some 600 million folks today with cell phones who are accessing the internet. And the potential for innovation, the potential for business, the potential for information sharing is just huge. And I think Africa is very much on the brink of a digital revolution. Two other points I wanted to flag, and that is Africa's story and Nollywood. Nollywood produces more content than any other place in the face of the earth except for Bollywood, Hollywood. So about 2,500 films and other forms of content are created in the Nigerian film industry and other parts of the continent. This is so important because this is Africa telling Africa's story. And that's what we need to be party to. And that's what we need to hear. So this young film industry happens to be the second largest employer in Nigeria of about 1 million employees, but it's so critical. And as Nollywood rises, I think we need to be there in partnership. And the final issue I'll flag, there are others, but the final issue I'll flag is governance. There's just no question that this has to be front and center, and that we have to be working in all of our areas. I work in the private sector. I work with a lot of companies. And the things I try to achieve is anti-corruption, compliance with labor standards, compliance with environmental standards, investing in communities, training people. And I think that's all part of the good governance dynamic. Obviously, USAID has many programs related to parliaments and elections. That's all very important too. But I think the private sector has a very important role in accelerating good governance. So the second point, time's up. I got to wrap it up. Okay, I'm getting the hook here, but just 2 more points. One more point.
Half a point.
Half a point. Okay, so here's the deal. Next week is the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, the first since 2014. This is a really big deal. And I think it's incumbent on all of us just to be watching so closely, and for each of us to have a takeaway that we continue to work on. afterwards. I know I'll be doing it from where I sit, working with companies, being here at the Wilson Center, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to hold everybody accountable next week for their commitments and implementing their commitments. So with that,
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'll toss it back to you.
Thank you very much. And now let me turn the conversation over to Dr. Joy, who's beaming in from New York City. Welcome.
Hello, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whichever part of the world you are. It's such a pleasure to join you today, such a distinguished panel of contributors to these papers. The paper that I've put forward and the way in which I'd like to use the 3 minutes is really to talk about how we can recalibrate a U.S.-Africa partnership in the dispensation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also AGOA. And I'd like to make 3 points. One is that the Africa in which AGOA was created does not exist anymore. The second point is that we have important learnings on the implementation of AGOA that we should use to frame its future. And then the third point will be about the how-to questions on an AGOA dispensation, especially linked to AfCFTA. So very quickly, the Africa for which AGOA was promulgated has substantially changed. In fact, it does not exist anymore. From the perspective of the political economy and the dispensations surrounding the continent and how it deals with relations. I'll tell you why. One, at the time that AGOA was promulgated, you did not have Agenda 2063. And that means that Africa, something has shifted on the continent in the sense that the continent now has much more clarity as to what it wants and how it wants to get there. And therefore, when you're thinking about a partnership with these 55 countries, the best place to start looking is Agenda 2063. So for example, the biggest priority in the first 10-year implementation plan of AGOA was really this question of deepening integration and fast-tracking the African Continental Free Trade Area. And so how do you think of a partnership at this point in time that is married very much to building on that idea? And that takes me to my second point, which is the second change, the AfCFTA, a groundbreaking instrument that promises to dismantle barriers to intra-African trade, and behind that, to create a made in Africa revolution. The AfCFTA is really about a new consciousness on the continent that we have to make in Africa. And so when you think about a partnership in that dispensation, it has to build on that. And then the third point is really China and the way in which China has gone to the continent, the model of development cooperation that China has introduced with African countries. This is a different type of partnership. This is a partnership that lives behind rails, airports, bridges. It goes beyond policy and strategy. And so from the African perspective, you're structuring a partnership with the largest, strongest economy in the world. And you're thinking, well, how does it relate to that model? So that was the first point. The second point is that there are learnings from AGOA that must teach us about how to move ahead. AGOA was a big success from the perspective of demonstrating the potential of diversification in the narrow sectors in which it was achieved. So textiles, for example. And so you have good stories coming out of Lesotho, out of Kenya, out of Ghana. But by and large, I think that's where it stopped, from the perspective of really utilizing these tariff sort of lines and building value-added products for export to the US. So why is it that when Africa trades with Africa, you see more value added, but in AGOA, you still see the pool of commodities and raw materials? The next dispensation has to be about elevating and digging deep on that which made it impossible for Africa to export value added under AGOA in that dispensation. So those are the learnings. The third and last point, because we can't do much in 3 minutes, is really the how-to questions of where we go next. And here I have really 3 key points. One is that both parties must come to the table willing to listen, willing to respect each other's views. In the Agenda 2063 dispensation, we cannot create something in DC and give it to the African counterparts as a gift. It has to be co-creation. And therefore, that's the starting point. And I think this is the tone that has been in all the opening remarks, the respect, the listening, the co-creation. The second point is that AGOA has to be, the good way to proceed with AGOA would be to extend it on its non-preferential terms, because this allows the AfCFTA baby the chance to get up to stand, to walk. And it gives Africa the capacity, the possibility to strengthen practice with production, with value-added exports, and ultimately beneficial integration into that global trading system of which the US would be party. The third point is really that we have to think of AGOA plus, because I think one of the reasons why AGOA did not go too far is really this question around the complementary measures on which we did not put a foot on the pedal. So things like technology, like finance, things like infrastructure. We have to think about an AGOA plus package that strengthens that, of course, non-reciprocal aspect, but really doubles down on how the partnership can boost capacity in those other areas. To close off, I think there's something new to be said about strengthening the power of the diaspora in a US-Africa partnership in this dispensation. Why? Because it might attract even more the possibility of investment to be a channel for the US to participate in accelerating the ideals of the AfCFTA by bringing brick and mortar investment on the continent through the diaspora, who for many reasons would like to see the continent prosper. But more so, really to just keep the relationship going in a manner that is strong, that is sustainable. There's much more in the paper, but let me stop there for now and I'll engage in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn the discussion over to Dr. Godfrey. The floor is yours. I see that you are dutifully setting a timer.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy, and happy to be part of this exciting panel. So in the paper that I wrote, which is about the US-Africa engagement on food, to strengthen food security, of course, it has 4 sections. I give background on the challenge of food insecurity on the continent, where 20% of Africans were hungry in 2021. That's over 300 million people. I do talk about the drivers of food insecurity, and I'm aligned with Whitney's points. But perhaps to add on the opportunities for Africa's food market. So definitely I agree with Whitney on the high population growth and what it means as a market of 1.3 billion people. Rising incomes on the continent. Africa is not the poor continent of 20 years ago. Incomes have risen. The middle class is growing, and they demand high-value commodities. So that is an opportunity for the food market. Several speakers have talked about the opportunities that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is creating. We see opportunities for increasing trade in agricultural commodities across the continent, from food surplus countries to food deficit countries. The other opportunity that we see is and Joy has just talked about Agenda 2063. Africa has become quite consistent in its policy pursuit. And in the agricultural sphere, we have the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, CAADP, that has been around now for 19 years. And the continent has been consistent in not changing that framework, simply enhancing its implementation. Now, coming to the opportunities for increasing food production on the continent, to make sure that the continent is food secure. I make 4 points in the paper, but now I'll just talk about 2 in the remaining 1.5 minutes. So the first one is about increasing production and productivity on the farm. And this is going beyond talking to actually making it happen through helping farmers to access ag productivity increasing inputs, particularly high quality seeds and animal breeds, as well as access to affordable fertilizers. That has to happen. And here the role of the private sector is very critical, particularly linking up with the US private sector that has a lot of experience in supporting farmers and also cutting edge technologies. The second point that I make is around infrastructure, and this point was made much earlier. We need to connect African markets, African food markets, from Mombasa to Dakar, from Cape Town to Cairo. We need to have reliable infrastructure that can connect these markets reduce transaction costs, and therefore move foods across the continent cheaper and contribute to reducing food insecurity. And the role of the private sector is very important, especially through public-private partnerships. We see them across the continent where governments are partnering with the private sector to invest in roads infrastructure. This can be expanded to railways and to transcontinental highways. And I think the U.S., this is an area where there are opportunities. Finally, before I keep quiet, is around the issue of facilitating trade. We have been working with the USDA in the area of supporting African Union to develop continental policy frameworks around sanitary and phytosanitary SPS, and also increasing our work on food safety, as well as opportunities for improving infrastructure across the continent. For Africa to succeed in trading in food, it has to be safe food. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, you're going to have trade, I don't want to call them trade wars, but trade barriers happening across countries if food that is traded is not safe. I'll be happy to come back through the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn the floor over to Ms. Pensilia, because Dr. Gilpin's technology is quite wonderful, but it's not stable enough, so we'll wind up with his short video remarks, and then we'll have question and answers. And before you start, let me also remind our online audience that they can submit questions through the website or to tweet at us at Africa Up Close. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I flew in from Kenya to come to attend this event, and I was thinking about on my flight the whole time how I cannot recall the last time that I've had to use cash or even seen cash in Kenya. And if you've been to Nairobi, then you know almost everything from electricity bills, my hair, my nails, restaurants. It's all paid for through mobile money applications. And so imagine my surprise when I arrived at this Your Dulles airport. And the taxi driver asked me for cash or credit. I was flabbergasted. And I say this to reinforce the point that Dr. Joy made earlier, which is the Africa of today is not the Africa of yesterday. There is a mobile phone revolution, a digital transformation that is underway. And when we think about a 21st century partnership, we have to take these things into consideration. Whitney alluded to the fact that there are some 600 million Africans connected to the internet today, mostly through the phone. And over the next 5 years, 300 million more will come online. So from an economic standpoint, what that means is that by 2025, Africa's internet economy will be worth $180 billion. And the African Union is doing everything it can to promote universal digital access. So I think the point we are making is that this is not some far-flung, far-fetched dream. 2025, it'll be New Year's in a few weeks. 2025 is in 2 years from now. So what are we doing to prepare ourselves? As the United States, private sector, and the U.S. government, we need concerted, deliberate, and coordinated investment partnerships, specifically in the tech sector. We know this is an entry point where we can have some success and upon which we can anchor our trade and investment relationship. So in my paper, I focus on 4 areas where we can direct our investments: on talent, that's skilling and education of the tech talent on the continent; innovation, that's really supporting the startup ecosystem, driving more venture capital investment on the continent, and looking at things like AI and cloud; on infrastructure, so that's the issue of connectivity. How do we bring more people online equitably across the continent? And then lastly, on regulation, creating the legal framework for the startup and the tech ecosystem to thrive through laws on fair competition, tax, and these sorts of things. So I'm going to stop just to say that if we are able to develop this public-private partnership between the U.S. Sector, we will be able to remain more competitive with our Chinese, EU, and Russian competitors who are fiercely fighting for this space and recognize the trade and investment opportunity in the tech space on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And may I invite our colleagues from audiovisual to play Dr. Gilpin's remarks for our audience here and online.
Development finance, as we know it today, has its roots in post-World War II reconstruction in Europe. The fundamental premise has always been that temporary cash inflows, i.e. development aid, could help a country cushion unexpected economic shocks and provide uninterrupted fiscal space to allow the functioning of a government and the provision of public goods and services. This was the context in which the Marshall Plan was designed for Europe, and the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were birthed in July 1944. Contrary to widespread belief, $13 billion that United States provided under the Marshall Fund did not rebuild Europe. By 1948, the major European economies were on a path to economic recovery. What the plan did was to help preserve macroeconomic stability in a time of uncertainty and containing inflation by providing economies with the temporary assistance they needed to facilitate the importation of food and essential supplies. Unfortunately, the mistaken notion that development financing is primarily a gap-filling exercise has taken hold over the ages. Consciously or unconsciously, this notion has influenced development financing provided by both multilateral institutions and bilateral agencies. The African continent is vastly different from post-World War II Europe in important ways. First, the challenges being faced by African countries are persistent and structural, not temporary. African countries are at the bottom of the global value chains and cannot trade their way out of poverty. Second, African countries are not competitive in the global trading system and do not have easy market access. Third, Africa's financial, economic, social, and political institutions are very fragile. This makes it harder for them to prevent fiscal diversion, financial leakages, and waste. Fourth, African countries lack most of the capital, infrastructure, and technology required to boost productivity and lift millions out of poverty, in spite of the continent's tremendous natural resource endowment. Fifth, many African countries have experienced persistent political uncertainty and instability, coupled with episodes of violent conflict. Failure to reflect these peculiarities in the design, direction, timing, and scale of development financing is a recipe for disaster. According to a book published by Greg Mills, a South African economist, titled Expensive Poverty, African countries received some $1.2 trillion in development aid between 1990 and 2020. That's equivalent to $1,000 per capita. Over this time, average income per capita increased by only $350. Unlike the 1990s, when development accounted for roughly 3/4 of Africa's capital inflows, by 2020 it accounted for less than 40%. Today, loans and remittances account for most of the inflows. Non-concessional loans increase the cost of borrowing and exacerbates the debt burden for most of these countries. Foreign direct investment has increased over the last few decades, but it's concentrated in only a handful of countries. Although concessional lending and grants have decreased, the underlying development financing philosophy has not changed. Therefore, a compelling case can be made for an overhaul of development financing, particularly as it pertains to Africa. First, we must reframe the development financing narrative. Aid must be temporary, and the framing must reflect equity, sustainability, and poverty reduction in a meaningful way. In order to accomplish this, we must stop thinking about development assistance as a function of what donors are willing or able to provide, and more about what Africa needs to finance critical infrastructure, technology, and human capacity development gaps. Then, we must view development assistance as an instrument to finance structural economic transformation and less about funding individual projects. We must also espouse a mutual accountability framework. The United States' approach to development financing has evolved over the years. A decade after the establishment of the U.S. Agency for International Development in 1961, the U.S. established the Overseas Private Investment Corporation in 1971 in recognition of the crucial role played by the private sector in the development process. Established in 2004, the Millennium Challenge Corporation introduced development compacts that linked development financing to good governance. OPIC was revamped, and the Development Finance Corporation was established in 2019 with Investing for Development as its tagline. The U.S. also experimented by establishing the Task Force for Business and Stability Operations in 2006 to finance economic development efforts in the aftermath of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, much more needs to be done. First, we need to elevate development assistance, particularly USAID, to cabinet level. This will make it more effective. Invigorating U.S. development financing could also involve the establishment of a coordinating mechanism, similar to the role played by the National Security Council in defense and security matters. The United States can also empower African initiatives that enable the continent to make full use of its natural and financial resources, including the $500 billion worth of reserves held by the continent's pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and financial institutions. The U.S. can also help future-proof development financing by considering support for development financing instruments that cater to the development financing needs of the future. These include sustainability bonds, carbon trading, and diaspora bonds. The U.S. can also forge strategic partnerships with private finance and technology firms. It could leverage its market position to be both a catalyst and a de-risker. And finally, the U.S. should invest in an exit ramp from the persistent cycle of development aid to a consistent and coordinated effort that would reduce aid dependency meaningfully.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Whitney for conversation. And again, we are seeing comments from, let me invite more questions via the chat thing, and to our colleagues and participants here in person and online, the papers that our authors are writing will be distributed after the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. We want them to be able to incorporate outcomes and discussions that take place next week into their publications. They will be available on our website. Please make sure that you are on the Africa program at the Wilson Center's mailing list. Whitney, yours.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Great papers. Let me just sort of jump in, Dr. Joy, and start with you. I was struck in your paper by many things, but one theme that sort of keeps coming up today and in all the papers is sort of how we can work together. And I was struck by Dr. Joy, your underscoring of 10 value chains identified by AfCFTA and UNDP. And could you just elaborate on that idea and the impact that it can have?
Okay, thank you very much. From a method perspective, UNDP and the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area have this flagship report that we produce annually. The 2021 version was titled, first of all, the flagship report is called the Futures Report. And the 2021 version that Dr. Raymond Gilpin and I, together with Dr. Mangeni, were editors for, was called Which Value Chains for a Made in Africa Revolution? And what we did really was to try and take the AfCFTA out of this complex treaty and policy text into the substance of what business can look at and understand that this is what is changing on the market because of the AfCFTA, i.e., you take the offers that countries are making, their tariff offers, what would their new tariff book look like because of the AfCFTA? What is the preferential treatment because of the AfCFTA? And when you look at that and analyze it from a value chains perspective, we identified that 10 value chains are emerging. These are powerful because they tell you about industrialization, diversification, structural economic transformation. And these are the following. 1, automobiles. 2, lithium-ion batteries, which of course we know are key for the green cars. 3, leather and leather products. 4, clothing and textiles. 5, soya. 6, cocoa. 7, pharmaceuticals. 8, vaccines. 9, mobile financial services, which is what Priscilla was talking about. And then 10, cultural entertainment services, which you were talking about in terms of Nollywood. What this means from an investment perspective is that these are the sectors where a safe bet could be made that if I engage and position to invest in these sectors, the promise of preferential treatment of the AfCFTA would be granted on the condition, since we're in a US-Africa conversation, on the condition that you have established sort of commercial, like not briefcase companies, but proper investment. You are resident in the country, you're producing out of those countries, and therefore can certify the requirements for rules of origin. And so for me, I guess to sum up the answer, it is that the value chains are basically where the investment choices can be safely made as a bet, because that is where the tariff offers are pointing and the services offers are pointing towards preferential treatment.
And just one follow-up, what would you like to see the Biden administration do, the U.S. government do, to make that a reality?
The first thing is to complement the idea I spoke about as AGOA Plus, because AGOA was structured as this idea of come into the US. We've seen what utilization looks like. So what I'm saying, the plus is about investment and the US going big on investment. So the Biden administration, to answer your question, would incentivize US business to invest on the continent of Africa, particularly in the countries that have ratified the agreement, and start to establish, together with local companies, through joint ventures, production chains that respond to some of those value chains.
That's terrific. Well, just I like the idea of incentivize. A number of us have been talking about a tax incentive related to AGOA to help U.S. companies lower the risk of investing, and I think that's certainly an idea that we need to keep front and center in coming weeks and months. Dr. Godfrey, let me go to you and the issue of food security and Africa being a food self-reliant. One of the hot button issues is GMOs. And very interested in your view. I know I'm jumping right into it here, but I tell you, we did a study with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the U.S.-Kenya Free Trade Agreement. And one of the issues we heard from companies was the need for GMOs and how that would boost investment in the agricultural sector. And I know under President Kenyatta, that was allowed in the cotton sector. One of the first things that President Ruto did was to expand the access for GMOs, got a lot of pushback. And just wondering, what's your view on GMOs and solving the food insecurity issue on the continent?
Do you want me to go back to Africa?
No, not before the panel's over.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You should have warned me about this question. Yeah, let me put it this way. We see the role of biotechnology being key, meaning the role of science and its applications to boosting ag productivity on the continent through research that generates technologies that are adaptable or that can adapt to Africa's realities, raising productivity, but also adapting to climate change. So our focus on the continent is to undertake research that will develop those technologies that support farmers to raise productivity. The space of GMOs is there, but at the moment it is that much. There is a lot of debate on the continent to the space that can be given to GMOs. We had thought that the decision by President Ruto, as soon as he came into office, to open space for GMOs in Kenya, was that opportunity on the continent, besides, of course, South Africa. But for much of Africa that is still hesitant around GMO technologies, that was going to open up the space. But I think it was last week that the court slammed a halt on that decision. So to me then, that shows that actually there is still a lot of ground to be gained on the continent for GMOs to be acceptable. And I think that conversation needs to be advanced, in my opinion, if we can assure the African farmer that their seed, especially around crops, that they are not handing over their future or their livelihoods to some foreign companies that are going to control them.
Sure.
That is at the heart of this debate.
Interesting.
Secondly, also allaying the fears around the effects of GMO foods on human health. So these two aspects on the continent, a lot of information and knowledge is needed to cool down the suspicions and the temperatures around the subject.
Great. Thank you for that very candid answer. That
I hope I go back home.
that I think threaded the needle quite effectively. Just one follow-up. In your paper, you talk about the need for data and research. And what areas do you think need to be at the top of the list for more research to enhance Africa's ability to feed itself?
Well, in the paper, I talk about the need for stronger data systems around for selfish regions around agriculture data. A lot of data systems on the continent are weak. We have been tracking the implementation of the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program now 6 years in a row, every 2 years, as demanded by our heads of state and government. But we see the weaknesses in the data systems. And you cannot plan without accurate data. You cannot strategize without accurate data. You cannot formulate credible policies without credible data. So I argue that we need to invest in strengthening data collection, archiving, and retrieval systems on the continent. And we call upon the partnerships that need to be created to be able to do this, working with the FAO, also philanthropies. I know the Gates Foundation, for example, has this initiative around 50 by 30. It's a global initiative, but some focus on the continent. Strengthening data collection systems on agriculture to inform planning and decision making is very important. And I also want to agree with the point that was made by the last gentleman online, Gilpin, around strengthening mutual accountability platforms. We do have that on the continent around agriculture through the CADA biannual review mechanism, but we still have a lot to do in terms of using the tool to create meaningful dialogue between policymakers and practitioners, policymakers and development partners, to have meaningful discussions around actions that need to be taken that are revealed through our biannual review mechanism on what countries need to do to transform their food systems to ensure food security.
Great. And one last question. The summit, what are you looking for as an outcome? What does success look like from your perspective for next week?
For next week, the short-term outcome will be good conversations between African and U.S. leaders, but I think the proof will be what investments or actions can be taken, 6 months, 18 months from now, where we see more interest in the U.S. private sector. I have to emphasize that the future of Africa and the U.S. has to be around private sector initiatives, seeing private capital flow from the U.S. to the African market through investments. the aid that comes from the U.S. government is appreciated, but it's a tiny proportion of what is possible from the U.S. to Africa through private sector initiatives. So I'm hoping that this dialogue can stimulate interest in the U.S. private sector to see opportunities that are available on the continent for mutually beneficial outcomes.
Great, thank you very much. So, Priscilla, turning to you, you have such a rich background, having been in government, now the private sector, so you can speak to both. And let me start with your idea about building a growth agenda around Africa talent. How do we do that? What does that look like? Does the Young Africa Leaders Initiative become part of the conversation? What about other initiatives?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think this paper was an important exercise for me as I was sharing to kind of marry my former public service career with what I know about the private sector and the best of the U.S. government and the magic of technology. So on talent and building a growth agenda, we currently have about 716,000 software developers on the continent. And they are concentrated in the largest tech economies on the continent. So Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt in North Africa. So we have to look at what these countries are doing to nurture and cultivate the tech ecosystem successfully. And what they are doing is creating education systems, adding things like software developer training as part of university programs, working in partnerships with the private sector. Google, for example, offers courses online. Many of these software developers, about a quarter, are self-taught. So they've just gone online and taught themselves how to acquire these skills to build these apps. So imagine what could be possible if we had the strength of the U.S. government, the African governments behind these private sector programs. I think YALI is an amazing initiative. We have exchange programs where we can bring African talent and U.S. tech talent together. And to create a beautiful blend of innovation. So I talk about that a lot in the paper.
Yeah, that's great. And just sort of building on that, again, where, drawing on your two hats here, you recommend, or you note that the USG has an opportunity to create a bespoke commercial diplomacy initiative through USTR State and Commerce to enable e-commerce platforms to facilitate greater U.S.-Africa trade. Again, what does that look like, and what should we be advocating for and pushing towards?
Thank you. Yeah, so I talk about some of the things that other partners are doing on the continent right now, and China is one of them. China is working with about 10 African countries right now to export African products to the Chinese markets. And they're using Chinese e-commerce platforms like Alibaba. So we have our own e-commerce platforms, and we're looking at how can we export African goods to the continent. AGOA is stuck. How do we rejuvenate it? Why don't we look at how we can use our e-commerce platforms to export African goods to the continent and American goods, vice versa? I feel like we have this vehicle that is available. We just haven't tapped into its potential yet. And so we can learn from that model and do it ourselves.
And let me ask you the same question. What does success look like for the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit to you and to Google? What are you looking to see?
So the U.S. administration will be releasing its Digital Africa Strategy, which is its foreign policy agenda for this digital landscape. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like. But more importantly, I'm hoping for an opening for the strategy to be the beginning of a collaborative process with the private sector. Because the tech industry is evolving and constantly changing, I think it's impossible for regulation to keep up with the pace of the innovations that are coming out. And so we have to look at a new model for policy development and strategy development around technology and innovation. So I talk about Rwanda. They've developed this sandbox regulatory license. It's a collaborative process. You work with the private sector to regulate the industry while they're developing the technology, and you're sort of following and working together in tandem. So I'd like the U.S. to look at this sort of a model as well. How do we work together collaboratively to develop models around tech in Africa?
And you also talk about the Nigerian Startup Act.
Yes.
I mean, is that a model that should be replicated
That is an
across the continent?
amazing model. The startup industry is the foundation of the tech ecosystem. And Africa's startup scene is booming. Last year, African startups raised over $4 billion. Again, 81% of that funding went to those 4 countries that I mentioned earlier: Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt. So we have to look again at what are these countries doing right to attract that investment. And one of the things that Nigeria did this October was pass a Nigeria Startup Act. So it's a law that creates incentives for the people with the ingenuity and the ideas to bring their innovations to life, intellectual property protections, as well as some of the regulatory frameworks for fair competition and tax. So that law was created in partnership between the Nigerian presidency and the startup ecosystem together. And I think having these sorts of conversations between the industry and the regulators is an excellent model. We don't have to look far for models for how to do things.
It's happening right
It's
in front of us.
happening, exactly.
We just have to get to know it better.
Exactly, that's right.
So did we lose Raymond?
I think so.
Can I make a comment about his
Bet.
presentation?
Please do. Please do.
So-
And then-
No, I'm here.
Oh,
Raymond.
Raymond, you're here. Terrific.
How are you, my friend?
Doing very well, Whitney.
Yeah, great. Excellent presentation. Very much enjoyed it. And I was struck by, your analysis that African countries are contending with persistent structural gaps as it relates to infrastructure, technology, and others. And I'm just wondering if from where I sit, sort of marrying an effort to mobilize funds for those gaps and taking the 10 value chains that Dr. Joy was talking about, it seems that we have the opportunity to be much more strategic about how we make investments in Africa, how we mobilize public funds in such a way that it can catalyze the private sector. So we just invite you just to talk about that for a second.
Oh, thank you so much, Whitney. And it's really a pleasure to be on such an illustrious panel. And I think that the way my paper starts is having a quick retrospective on what development financing has been in the past, and making the point that the business as usual, crafting it all around aid just will not cut it. But what we need to do is take a look at some of these structural challenges that I identified and see how best we could garner the financing that they need. And part of the transition, Whitney, has to be moving away from thinking about development financing as how could America raise money to help Africa, and see how America could be helpful in ensuring that Africa can use its own money a lot better to plug some of these gaps. Let me give you two examples. If you total assets under management for all the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and some insurance companies in Africa, it's about half $1 trillion US. And I think the question has to be, how do we leverage those? So maybe some of that financial muscle could be used to de-risk some of the borrowing that's going to be necessary to meet these needs. Secondly, we have varying estimates about how much Africa loses every year in terms of illicit finance flows. And the way to plug that would be to have the technology and the skills to ensure that African countries could enter just contractual arrangements for the use of these resources, and also help with taxation and oversight support. And so that rather than, as UNCTAD estimates, some 90 billion leaving the continent every year in illicit financial flows, even if we have a fraction of that it will be very, very instrumental in directing towards these development financing needs. And so part of the conversation has to be this transition from the Africa of yesterday, when development financing investment was all about how do we raise new money outside Africa to help Africa, to the Africa of tomorrow, which is how do we support initiatives that enable Africa's own resources to address these issues.
Great. Completely agree with that. And in that respect, let me pick up on the issue of remittance flows and go to Nigeria. In 2017, Nigeria created a diaspora bond, and it was oversubscribed immediately to the tune of about $300 million. It was successfully paid out in June of this year at about a 5% interest. It was denominated in hard currencies, pounds, dollars, and it was tremendously successful. And it's so interesting to me, and I guess my question to you is, can that be a model? How do we get more diaspora bonds? How do we get more governments to mobilize that kind of diaspora, those kinds of diaspora resources in such a way that they can be used for developmental purposes? The money's secure, it actually pays a benefit to the investor. And is this something on your radar screen?
Yeah, absolutely. Remittance flows at the moment almost double the amount of aid that Africa receives every year. But as you know, Whitney, the vast majority of those flows currently go towards consumption uses. How we divert them to development investments requires specialized financing instruments. Diaspora bonds are one such example. And yes, the Nigeria bonds went well. But a number of other African countries have tried diaspora bonds in the past, and they haven't really worked. Here at UNDP, we recently did some research into that to see what makes diaspora bonds successful and what makes them, less of a success, even if there's not just whether or not they're subscribed or oversubscribed, but how are they channeled? And I think we came up with three things. The first is trust, and that trust in economic governance. Second, they have to be focused on a specific purpose and not just diaspora bonds to support the central budget. And thirdly, the institutional and regulatory framework in a number of countries have to be adjusted, amended to ensure that these flows could not just be received, but also channeled appropriately. And we think that this is one area that could be impactful, but making sure that we are able to not just create a capacity, but strengthen the existing institutions to cater to these flows is crucial.
Great, thank you. And finally, what are you looking for a successful summit
Quickly.
next week?
Sorry.
Quickly.
Yeah, I think a successful summit would just be shifting the prism from the Africa of yesterday to the possibilities of tomorrow. And one of the major financing needs are the financing needs around green transitions in Africa. And that's going to be something that requires financing instruments that the U.S. could be very helpful in facilitating.
Great. Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you all to our panelists. Let's open the conversation to our audience here in person and online. We are short for time, and we have a special guest to offer some concluding remarks. So we're going to take 3 questions. Introduce yourself, identify your organization, and please make it a question. If you talk long, I will have them take the microphone away. Lawrence and Philippe. See, the Africa world is small. I haven't seen these folks in 20 years, and I still know their names. Yes, you're good.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to see you again, Raymond. I enjoyed your presentation. And in all honesty, I've been involved in Africa work for over 30 years, and I'm 71 and a half, so I think I may have used the panelist up there. But the central question for Africa has been addressed many times. It's on infrastructure development. And this is the foundation. And the Agenda 2063 has the high-speed rail network in it. We need transformational programs in infrastructure, energy, roads, and railroads. And I think Raymond hit the question right. We have to transform our development policy. And rather than giving aid simply, I'm working with a group of Africans to develop an African Industrial Development Bank where we would invest money in infrastructure. And I would like to see, would you agree, Raymond, at the summit, that the United States could make a deposit into this infrastructure bank of capital that could then be lent out for infrastructure, and that this would have a great transformational effect?
Thank you. Philippe?
Hi, thanks so much. Philippe de Ponte, I'm an independent consultant. Great panelists. A lot of talk about what we want to see from the summit. I guess I want to tighten that up a little bit, and perhaps to Whitney in particular. I think you've sort of been in this on the U.S. side, the Washington side of these questions. So my question for you or others is not what do we want to see, what do we expect to see? Is there going to be that big initiative? Is this digital fund going to be on a par with the Africa Power Initiative or PEPFAR? Those are high bars, or not? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take question over here. Okay. And then I will read a couple of the questions that have come in online, and I will ask our panelists to offer brief, concise, and insightful replies. Please.
Yes, good morning. I'm Darnley Howard, president of Advanza International, and I'm reading about an Africa-led initiative around international tax cooperation and a related UN resolution. And I'm wondering what the panel thinks of this idea of international tax cooperation and what it will do to attract or not U.S. companies from investing in Africa.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that has come in is, where do you see, from Ovidiu Bujoren, the Technical Director of Investments at ACDI VOCA, where do you see the most potential for entrepreneurship initiatives in Africa, and what types of industries do you see with exponential potential? Another question is, would the U.S. consider partnering with Africa for the production of final goods and products and not just importing raw materials? From Mr. James Eastman. And then the third is from Astrid Rees, Vice President of Africa of Onivo Motors. The automotive sector is one of 10 key value chains for investment on the continent. How can U.S. investment be reoriented from assembly of imported foreign car kits to real investment that actually develops the African automotive sector? So we have very little time. These are really very interesting questions, and it's very important that we have our concluding remarks. So who would like to address the questions posed by our online or in-person audience? And I'll give you each 1 minute. I'm setting the timer here. Whitney, you want to go?
For 1 minute. Okay.
1 minute.
So what do we expect to see? Philippe, I think, as Pensilia said, the administration has been working on an issue on digital transformation. What that looks like, we don't know yet. I don't know yet, but hopefully it's something that provides a platform for something incredibly impactful that mobilizes a lot of resources from the private sector. I just want to jump on the automotive investment because 3 years ago, Ford Motor Company invested $1 billion in its plant in South Africa. That's a big number. And they did that because they were working with the South African government. They've been in South Africa 75 years. They've got a great relationship with its workforce. They have a favorable tariff relationship exporting to the EU. And I think that's a bit of a model. You know, governments need to cooperate with the private sector, with labor, and we've got to get the tariffs right.
Thank you. Who else would like to take the question? Pensilia?
Sure, I'll take the question on tax. Just to say that, yes, there is interest in this issue in international tax cooperation. The OECD has been leading some global discussions on corporate tax reform. We're seeing a lot of countries that are targeting specifically U.S. tech companies with tax discrimination. And so I think closer collaboration on tax systems, we want to have predictable tax regimes across the continent. I think that's definitely an important mechanism.
Any other question you would like to address? No, I don't think that's okay. Godfrey?
Yes, maybe two remarks. I want to agree with the gentleman around infrastructure, addressing infrastructure deficits. I think we continue to make that call to increase investments to connect food and input markets. The instrument to be used, I think that's homework to be done. I don't know whether you need a special bank for that or repurposing the existing institutions to have instruments that can be used for, but that's a conversation that can be had. The second one I want to comment is on the potential areas for investment, and I am biased in agribusiness. Agribusiness or agro-industrial development presents a great opportunity for investment in Africa for the reasons that different panelists gave earlier. The population is growing, the middle class is growing, incomes are rising, and therefore the opportunity for this segment of the population to consume value-added products is very high. And so that is an opportunity because people will always eat, and so it's a sustainable business, if you ask me, agribusiness investments.
Thank you very much. Raymond, you want to take on some of these questions? 1 minute.
I'll just add very quickly to the tax question. I think international tax cooperation is central to reducing the $90 billion worth of illicit financial flows that leave the continent every year, and mention that UNDP's Tax Inspectors Without Borders partnership could be a model.
Thank you. Dr. Joy?
Yes, with Raymond's response, I have nothing useful to add on that part. I'd just like to say with respect to the industries, in addition to what our colleague from the African Union, who must be my Ugandan brother because we sound alike, in addition to what he said in terms of agro-processing, I would say there's huge opportunities in services. Investment in services. So the AfCFTA itself has prioritized 5 key sectors to start with: financial services, communication services, transport, business services, and tourism. All of these huge for investment. And then the final point I'd add on those is energy, because we need energy for the production that we're talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Whitney?
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I have now the privilege to introduce our very special guest speaker, His Excellency Albert Muchanga, who is the African Union Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals, and has shaped the debate already that we're having today, given his work over the last 5 and 10 years. Commissioner Muchanga is from Zambia. He was Zambia's ambassador to Brazil and to Ethiopia, and he was permanent representative to the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So, Commissioner Muchanga, let me invite you to the podium to share some thoughts with us. Thank you.
Someone dropped a pen. I'm not going to.
You're good. You're good.
Yes, sir. I'm not going to take long. First, to really appreciate the Africa program of the Wilson Center for organizing this event, just coming before the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, and also to appreciate the contributions by the panelists, the audience, and yourself who introduced the discussion, and the moderator. I think in all these interventions, a lot of insights were gained. I've got a team here, they're seated behind me. We are taking notes. We'll be able to internalize what has been discussed. And what is emerging is some form of meeting of minds that really there's room for improving AGOA, and that there should be some extension, and that there's need to move towards deeper economic integration anchored on the African Continental Free Trade Area. The issue of illicit financial flows came up, very big discussion. International cooperation on taxation also came up, and we are aware of the UNDP, Inspectors Without Borders. We'll be working with UNDP in this direction. And we are looking forward on the 16th of December, which is a few days away, when there's going to be debate in the UN General Assembly on the question of the United Nations taking some role on the critical question of tax cooperation, international tax cooperation. Because it's very, very vital to enhancing domestic resource flows across Africa. I think the issue on development finance was very, very clear. You cannot always depend on aid and hope to develop. You need to graduate out of aid dependence. And the facilitator of that graduation is domestic resource mobilization. So we are going to invest in that as African Union, and work has already started within our department. We're getting quite a number of experts on matters of taxation and tax policy. The key element of the African Continental Free Trade Area is industrialization. It has a huge scope to promote industrialization, because without trade in manufactured and agro-processed goods within Africa, the market cannot grow. And this calls for very, very close collaboration among the partners in promoting the development of regional and continental value chains. We have noted the work which is being done by UNDP and our colleagues at the African Continental Free Trade Area on value chain development on 10 areas. We have worked with the European Union, the International Trade Center, to come up with the 94 value chains. And we have identified 4 priority value chains. First one is the automobile industry, then textile industry, then baby foods, and pharmaceuticals. And this is where collaboration comes in. I listened to UNDP. They also have work on the automobile sector. So there's really no need for duplication of effort. And what I can say to UNDP, and it's good that Dr. Katanegwa is a lawyer, there's a very clear division of labor between the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area and the African Union Commission on the matters of industry. The African Union Commission is responsible for policy and programming. And the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area is responsible for promotion. And when it comes to policy making on matters of industry, it lies with a specialized technical committee on trade, tourism, industry, and minerals. The Council of Ministers of the African Continental Free Trade Area is only responsible for trade, though they may become as ministers for trade and industry from national capitals. When they sit in the African, as Council of Ministers of the African Continental Free Trade Area, they are only responsible for trade. So let us collaborate in this regard so that there's no duplication and there's no need to take decisions that may not be appropriate. Having said this, I think all of us coming from Africa are looking forward to a very, very successful summit. The moderator raised very critical questions to each and every contributor. What are your expectations? And we got the answers, very positive, very forward-looking. And we hope to go back to Africa with commitments that we are going to develop relations between the United States of America and Africa and trade and investments, and bringing all the players in a win-win situation where there's mutual benefit, there's mutual respect. And in the process, we consolidate the relations between Africa and the United States of America. And I'll end by the issue of diaspora. Again, there's a meeting of minds. It came up. There's a huge role to play for the African diaspora in developing these relations. Thank you for inviting us. Certainly, we've benefited, and we're going to make use of this information for the benefit of the ordinary Africans. At the end of the day, what we do is aimed at benefiting ordinary Africans. They should have better products to consume. They should have access to health facilities, access to energy, and for those with young people, access to schooling and the jobs thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wetenga. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. Please also join me in thanking the marvelous team of the Africa program at the Wilson Center, Hannah Akwibo, Gama Mahute, Sherry Ayers, Kyra Chambers, our interns. Interns are important. Dahlia Berkowitz, Daniel Lee. We couldn't do it without them. Thank you all. We've heard diaspora, trade, respect, investment, reduce aid dependence. A middle class is growing. The future of Africa is the private sector investment. You can see me squinting here. And language is important. We believe in this partnership, and we are very much looking forward to not just the words, but the actions that come out of next week's summit. I'd like to thank our online audience, and to those of you who have taken time to come and join us here. Be sure to be on our mailing list. Again, join me in thanking you all for a wonderful program. We've learned a lot. We go forward.